The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hello, and welcome once again to the massive open online orchestration course for another lesson in scoring strings. I'm your instructor, Thomas Goss. Today we're going to open the doorway to the scoring of larger ensembles by studying one more member of the string family, the viola. It might seem counterintuitive that we're turning back toward unaccompanied scoring one more time, just when we were starting to pick up steam with piano trio scoring last lesson. But the viola does go against intuition in a lot of ways, as we'll see. The reason for this goes deep into the history of instrument building itself, and with a fundamental choice that was made from the very beginning. To really understand this, let's jump back to the time when both the viol family and the violin family were being developed. For the viols, there was only one direction to play, which has become synonymous with the whole family, resting on the leg, or da gamba in Italian. Even the smaller and higher-pitched instruments were played in this way. This limitation led to a series of outcomes, the first of which was that very small viols capable of soaring melodies above the treble staff were quite rare and seldom played. The most popular model of viol became the one we most commonly think of today, the bass viola da gamba, for obvious physical and musical reasons. Physically, the bass was just the most ergonomically ideal, having about the same size and range of the cello, though with more strings and closer tuning in fourths with a third in the middle. The left-hand fingering was much closer to the eye, and bowing fell into the natural position of the right arm. The violin, however, sat on the arm, or da brachia. It seems to have been developed as an ideal model, with an enormous amount of calculation and development applied to a specific tuning and pitch, rather than as an interchangeable family like the viols. Placing the violin on the arm put everything right up next to the violinist's eyes, and made it much easier to play than the smaller viols. This may be one of the reasons why violins were more popular as folk instruments than concert instruments at first. But as the violin became more central to organized music playing, the need for ensemble instruments arose, creating a violin family to match that of the viols. But with greater range and wider space tuning, it wasn't necessary to produce 7 models. Only 2 more were necessary, the cello and the viola. And here we arrive at that fateful decision made by instrument builders. The cello had to be built as a da gamba-style instrument, played resting against the leg, and it's evident that the overall design of the cello borrows quite a bit from the bass viola da gamba. But what about the viola that we know? In order to play a middle-range instrument with a more ideal length of string, you'd need to rest it on your lap, because your arm wouldn't be able to reach out to the end of the fingerboard, and your shoulder couldn't take the weight. But that would make it more of a small cello. At the time of the viola's final development, there were very few cellists, and a growing multitude of violinists. So the viola was built to rest under the chin, allowing for a wider pool of possible players coming over from the violin, and so it remains to this day. With this practical solution came a lot of compromises. I discussed this in detail in the resources you're to study this week, especially tips 83 and 84 from my book 100 Orchestration Tips, which discuss limitations of range and acoustical compromises. Also of great importance to today's assignment are tips 85 and 87, and I'll refer to them in the upcoming lecture, but you might as well save tips 86 and 88 until next week's lesson on string trio scoring, where they'll be of most relevance. Some of the points in these tips are illustrated in practical ways in the Orchestration 101, the string section course, and I've assigned video chapters 26 and 27 as essential viewing. And of course you need to read up on the relevant chapters in your Adler, Piston, or Kennan orchestration manuals for some viola instrumentation basics. All these resources will prepare you for the task of scoring for unaccompanied viola in a way that intelligently explores the enormous variety and depth of technique and expression for this unjustly neglected instrument. and that approach will ensure that you'll use the instrument to its best advantage in the larger ensembles that we're about to take on in the last 3 lessons of this MOOC Term 1 course. In the MOOC Lesson 4 on piano trio scoring, I pointed out that the form was successful because it used the 2 most popular string instruments of violin and cello. Of course, if those 2 string family members are popular, then that naturally means that the viola isn't, or at least it's not as sought after or as utilized. If you compare lists of solo works, especially in the unaccompanied genre, you'll see that the viola has far fewer original works of significance, with much of its repertoire arranged from other instruments. Part of this has to do with its wonderful ability to blend in an ensemble situation, meaning that many violists are more accustomed to a team approach than being out in front much of the time, or even leading an ensemble. It's also an awkward instrument to play for the average violinist of smaller stature due to its greater size and weight. This has led to a bit of a reputation, as less committed student and amateur violinists are often shuffled down the roster to the viola section, where they become the target of a lot of jokes. But here's the truth. Professional violists are some of the finest musicians in the world, and many of them are looking for new material composed directly for viola that turns the compromises of the instrument into a strong sense of individuality. There's a big opportunity here for composers who are willing to build relationships with musicians and provide them with deserving material. And I know this because I personally benefited from such a relationship and was rewarded with many opportunities for performing and recording due to my contact with pro concert violists. I got a lot of respect and appreciation for my efforts, though admittedly I hadn't set out to use those relationships to my advantage. They just evolved due to the natural circumstances. Whether the music you score in this lesson leads to opportunities and contacts or not, the one thing it really can do is to make sure that you don't take the viola for granted. Writing boring, unimaginative parts for your violists because you don't understand them or respect them is only a reflection on you, not on them. It will hurt your score and make you look a lot sillier than the punchline of a viola joke. So let's really focus in on what great viola scoring reveals about the instrument on its own terms, and how you can build your own effective approach. Let's start with the core repertoire for unaccompanied viola, which for nearly all solo violists includes studying the Bach cello suites. The unaccompanied violin sonatas and partitas are also possible, just transposing everything down a fifth so that all the finger positions remain the same, but they're not quite as successful or convincing as the cello suites. This is because Bach explores the registers of his cello writing in a way that's more adaptable to viola. The bass register writing sits well on the lower strings of the viola. Likewise, the tenor register passages focus on richness of timbre and depth of meaning rather than soaring higher and higher in pitch. This approach translates very well to the viola's D and A strings, making them feel heartfelt rather than strained in sound. What's great about this traditional Bach adaptation for viola is that it helps you to understand the true character of viola registers, how to contrast them, and how those characters and contrasts parallel those of the violin and cello and yet have their own distinct qualities. For instance, as I mentioned in my own resources of the 100 Tips and the Orchestration 101 video course, the lowest C string is enormously foreshortened from its ideal length and tension. The cavity of the viola's soundboard is also much more shallow than ideal for this string. This means that the C string, while certainly rich, won't have the same quality of liquid darkness of the cello's C string. Meanwhile, the viola's G string is far more gentle than the violin's G, and is a great register in which to play with extreme elegance. Listen to how these lower strings contrast against the higher melodic register of the courant. You'll hear a lot of these transformational qualities yourself if you take the time to listen to the original cello versions of these movements and then compare them with the same on viola. One thing I'd like to cover before we move on is how poetically viola can interpret the sarabande. Played with the right approach, the movement evokes a sense of history and drama that puts Bach into the context of his time, not as some gifted precursor to the upcoming classical era, but as the master of a centuries-old tradition that was transcended to the heights of imagination, discipline, and craft. But putting all that aside, the wonderful simplicity of the scoring reveals the ability of the viola to shine in its own right, with an individual beauty of character. That's why this movement is so often used as a warm-up, meditation, and even audition piece for violists. There are many other great transcriptions out there from cello or violin to viola, and some great concert and chamber pieces composed specifically for the viola, like Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 6. But for strictly unaccompanied viola works, you have to do some digging. You'll find that there are some great pieces of writing for the genre, often by specialist performers of the past, rather than well-known composers. One such was Antonio Rolla, a virtuoso of both violin and viola who was a good friend and duo partner to Niccolo Paganini. He composed a set of 6 idylls for viola, the first of which has a dreamy, heartfelt character that wonderfully explores the individual nature of the instrument. It's certainly a piece that couldn't be realized the same way on violin or cello, and yet it has a folk simplicity and spontaneity that sounds like it was made up on the spot on a lazy summer's day. As you listen along to your score reading, notice the quality of the string tones, especially the very high-fingered notes on the G string at the start. There are 2 very well-known pieces of unaccompanied viola repertoire, both by great virtuoso pedagogues. Both are superbly written and revealing of precisely the unaccompanied approaches we're studying here. The first is Joseph von Blumenthal's Grand Caprice for solo viola. This is really a kind of etude fantasy type work, a real workout for technique and expression. One key feature of technique is the use of figuration and patterns, which I address in Orchestration Tip 87. Viola is naturally built for this kind of scoring, both in terms of more open spacing between fingering positions and in the kind of timbre that supports other voices. Here Blumenthal gets his point across with a lot of arpeggiation and broken chord patterns, which you should study in my recommended viewing to see for yourself the difficulties involved. I want you to be competent in scoring this approach yourself, because your violists will need it from you someday. The other unaccompanied viola chestnut is the Capriccio Hommage à Paganini by Henri Vieuxtemps. What I love about this piece is the superb high scoring for the A string, which should come off not nasal, as Adler and Piston might put it, but tender, warm, and lyrical. This is also great to study for its swooping runs and jagged triple and quadruple stops. It's actually far shorter and technically more simple than Blumenthal's Caprice, but I find it in many ways a much more effective and natural-sounding piece. Alongside these occasional little bonbons, violist teachers and composers were writing dozens of sets of etudes, method books, and other seemingly straight educational works. But some of these are actually incredibly well-conceived solos for the instrument, and make their way into the regular repertoire, like the 12 etudes, Opus 125, of Milan Conservatory professor Marco Anzoletti. The number 11 aria is an incredible exploration of the soul of the viola, with hugely rich scoring in the lower and middle registers, and only the occasional reaching upwards to the A string. Anzoletti also uses a technique of reaching over to gently touch the lower string while holding down a higher note in a devastatingly simple yet effective way. The whole set of etudes is worth studying to see what a master teacher might expect from his viola students, and what the limits of possibility might be for you in your scoring. And yet, like the other caprices and the idyll we just heard, these are shorter pieces, more suitable for encores or curtain openers than show closers. Serious multi-movement works intended as featured listening for concert-goers is even more rare. Every orchestrator who seriously studies the viola should be familiar with Hindemith's 2 unaccompanied viola sonatas. But not all viewers of this course may have access to his scores due to copyright restrictions in some countries. So I'll finish this lesson with a stylistically less modern but no less satisfying piece by Max Reger, the first of his 3 suites for unaccompanied viola. He scores with the same forceful intelligence that he put into his cello pieces, combining many aspects of viola scoring that we've covered here. The opening movement seems to echo Vieuxtemp's Capriccio and Bach's Sarabands, but note how he contrasts rich expressive lyricism from not just the high register, but the middle and low ranges as well. The second movement is a great study in double stops throughout, both as quickly articulated staccatos and as smoothly lush slurs. I also like the lovely contrast between opposite poles, from over the treble staff all the way down to first position on the C string. The third movement is a lovely hymn-like meditation, also relying heavily on double stops, getting a huge amount of natural resonance out of the viola despite the key signature of B-flat. This is terrifically effective, but my favorite moment is the all-too-short finale movement that rips through the viola's registers with abandon. It really proves that the compromises of the viola's timbre and construction are no barrier for a great player with a well-written score. I recommend that you score read the other suites by Reger, along with the Hindemith sonatas, and even more Bach viola-arranged cello suites if you have the time. Violin and cello are so ingrained in the hearing of most concert music listeners that forming an approach to their scoring can rely on a lot of well-developed instincts. But the same is seldom true for the viola. Take a bath in viola scoring. You've probably got a lot of catching up to do. But be careful, viola scoring can be addictive, and I should know after scoring quite a few pieces that feature the viola as soloist. I find it an enormously useful instrument. And once again, I can't stress this enough. Great violists need talented composers to supply them with more worthy solo repertoire, whether that's unaccompanied or duo sonatas, or even concertos. The field is very neglected, which is just another way of saying that here's an opportunity for the right composer who knows what they're doing and is inspired by the instrument. You may also need a lot of catching up on your alto clef reading. Don't settle for the "I know where middle C is, therefore that note is B" kind of approach. You need to be able to recognize the notes immediately, and eventually with the same easy familiarity that most musicians have with treble and bass clefs. This is even more essential than good tenor clef skills, and I've linked another page from that online notation training website. If you've never really given alto clef much thought, then you should actually make that training your very first step. After putting in a few sessions, your reading should become much more effortless. This lesson's scoring assignment includes all the approaches of unaccompanied violin and cello scoring, as applied to a 2 to 3 minute piece, but I'm going to add one more approach, figuration. Not that I want you to score a bunch of meaningless arpeggios. Rather, I encourage that you work out some kind of figuration into a part of your music. Not figuration all the way through, but in proportion to the flow and direction of the musical idea. It could be anything from a touch of broken chord to some dedicated arpeggiation. But experiment with this approach and see where it takes you. It may prove very useful to you when we add a violin and cello on either side of the viola to form a string trio next lesson. So get the most out of this lovely, unusual, and relatively unexplored instrument, and I'll see you again as we step forward into 3 final lessons of non-stop ensemble scoring.